September 11th, 1985. Federal Courthouse, Miami, Florida. Judge Eugene Spellman had presided over hundreds of criminal cases during his 23 years on the federal bench. Drug dealers, murderers, organized crime figures. He had seen them all break down, plead for mercy, or rage against the system that had finally caught them. But as he prepared to sentence Griselda Blanco, the woman federal prosecutors called the most dangerous criminal in American history, something felt different. The courtroom was packed with federal agents, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and journalists from around the world. Everyone wanted to witness the moment when La Madrina, the godmother of cocaine, would finally face justice for her crimes. What none of them expected was that Griselda Blanco would turn her sentencing hearing into a masterclass in psychological warfare. And the 7 words she spoke to Judge Spellman that day would haunt him for the rest of his career. To understand what happened in that Miami courtroom, you need to understand what it took to bring Griselda Blanco to trial. For 15 years, she had operated the most sophisticated drug trafficking network in the Western Hemisphere while remaining virtually invisible to law enforcement. The DEA had spent over 8 years building their case against her. They had intercepted thousands of phone calls, conducted surveillance operations across multiple countries, turned dozens of her associates into informants, and assembled over 40,000 pages of evidence documenting her criminal empire. The charges against her were staggering. Conspiracy to import and distribute cocaine, money laundering, racketeering, and continuing criminal enterprise. If convicted on all counts, she faced multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. But what made federal prosecutors most confident wasn't the mountain of evidence they had assembled. It was the testimony of Max Mermelstein, Griselda's former transportation coordinator, who had managed her smuggling operations for over 3 years before agreeing to cooperate with authorities. Mermelstein could describe in detail how Griselda's organization moved tons of cocaine from Colombia through a network of boats, planes, and secret compartments. He could explain her money laundering systems, her methods for corrupting government officials, her techniques for eliminating rivals and traitors. Most importantly, he could testify that Griselda Blanco personally ordered the deaths of over 40 people, making her responsible for more murders than any other defendant in federal court history. The trial lasted 4 months. Federal prosecutors presented evidence that Griselda's organization had imported over 3 tons of cocaine into the United States and generated revenues exceeding $300 million. They played secretly recorded phone conversations in which Griselda discussed business operations, territorial disputes, and personnel decisions that affected the lives and deaths of hundreds of people. They called witnesses who described Griselda's reputation for ruthless efficiency, her ability to inspire absolute loyalty among her employees, and her skill at eliminating threats before they could develop into serious problems. But throughout the entire trial, Griselda Blanco remained completely silent. She sat at the defense table wearing simple, conservative business suits, taking notes on a legal pad, occasionally conferring with her attorneys in whispers so quiet that even the court reporter couldn't hear them. She never showed emotion when prosecutors described the violence her organization had committed. She never reacted when former associates testified about her methods and motivations. She simply watched, listened, and waited. Her defense attorneys, led by renowned criminal lawyer Frank Rubino, argued that their client was being scapegoated by federal prosecutors desperate to claim a victory in the war on drugs. They pointed out that most of the evidence against Griselda came from criminals who had made deals with the government in exchange for reduced sentences. They suggested that Max Mermelstein and other cooperating witnesses were lying about Griselda's role in order to protect themselves and deflect blame onto someone who had become a convenient target. But even Rubino knew the evidence was overwhelming. The best he could hope for was to save Griselda from the death penalty and perhaps negotiate a sentence that would give her some possibility of eventual release. On September 10th, 1985, after deliberating for 18 hours over 3 days, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all charges. Griselda Blanco had been convicted of running a continuing criminal enterprise, conspiracy to distribute cocaine, and multiple counts of racketeering. Judge Spellman scheduled sentencing for the following day, giving both sides time to prepare their final arguments about what punishment would be appropriate for someone who had built a drug empire that destroyed thousands of lives. Federal prosecutors argued that Griselda Blanco represented a unique threat to American society. They pointed out that she had never shown remorse for her crimes, had never cooperated with law enforcement, and had continued to run her criminal organization even while on trial. They requested that Judge Spellman impose the maximum possible sentence, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 99 years to ensure that she would never again be free to harm innocent people. Griselda's defense attorneys made a final plea for leniency, arguing that their client was a mother of four who had grown up in poverty and turned to crime as a means of survival. They asked Judge Spellman to consider a sentence that would give Griselda some hope of eventually returning to her family. September 11th, 1985, 2:30 p.m. Judge Spellman entered the packed courtroom for the sentencing hearing. Court security had been increased due to threats that had been made against various participants in the trial. Federal marshals were positioned at every exit, and additional guards had been stationed throughout the building. As was customary in federal court, Judge Spellman asked Griselda if she had anything to say before sentence was imposed. Her attorneys had advised her to apologize to the victims of her crimes, to express remorse for the damage her organization had caused, to ask for mercy from the court and the community. Instead, Griselda Blanco stood up slowly and walked to the podium, positioned directly in front of the judge's bench. She was wearing a navy blue business suit and minimal jewelry. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple style that made her look more like a bank executive than one of the most dangerous criminals in American history. For a moment, she said nothing. She simply looked directly at Judge Spellman with the same calm, measuring expression she had maintained throughout the entire trial. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, waiting to see what the Godmother of Cocaine would say at this crucial moment. When Griselda finally spoke, her voice was clear and steady, carrying easily through the hushed courtroom. "Your Honor," she began, "I have listened to 4 months of testimony about my alleged crimes. I have heard prosecutors describe me as a monster, as someone who destroyed families and corrupted communities for personal profit." She paused, maintaining direct eye contact with Judge Spellman. "I have heard witnesses claim that I ordered the deaths of innocent people, that I built my success on violence and fear. I have been portrayed as someone who had no respect for human life, no concern for the damage my actions might cause." Judge Spellman leaned forward slightly, clearly intrigued by what seemed to be the beginning of an apology or expression of remorse. But what none of these witnesses, what none of these prosecutors, what none of these federal agents understood, Griselda continued, is that everything I did to protect my family and my community from people who would have destroyed us if we had shown any weakness. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. This wasn't going to be an apology. I grew up in the barrios of Madrina, where children died of starvation while rich families lived in mansions protected by corrupt police. I watched my mother work 16-hour days in factories owned by men who paid her wages that wouldn't feed a dog. I saw what happened to women who had no power, no resources, no ability to defend themselves. Her voice remained calm, but there was something underneath it now, not anger exactly, but absolute certainty. The men who prosecuted me, the agents who investigated me, the witnesses who testified against me, they all had choices I never had. They were born into families with money, with connections, with opportunities. They went to universities. They had careers handed to them by systems designed to protect people who looked like them and exclude people who looked like me. Judge Spellman's expression was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. This wasn't the kind of statement defendants usually made before sentencing. They want to punish me for refusing to accept the poverty and powerlessness they decided was appropriate for someone like me. They want to make me an example to other women, other immigrants, other people who dare to build something significant without their permission. Griselda stepped closer to the bench, maintaining that unsettling direct eye contact. "But here's what they don't understand. Your Honor, prison doesn't frighten me. Death doesn't frighten me. What frightens powerful men is the realization that someone they considered inferior is proven to be more intelligent, more strategic, more successful than they could ever be." The federal prosecutors at their table were exchanging worried glances. This was not going according to plan. I built an organization that moved billions of dollars across international borders. I managed operations in 12 countries. I employed thousands of people and provided for their families. I created systems that operated with more efficiency than most legitimate corporations. She gestured slightly toward the prosecution table. These men spent 8 years, thousands of agents, millions of dollars, and 40,000 pages of evidence to barely understand a fraction of what I created. And they still don't comprehend how someone like me could have outsmarted them for so long. Judge Spellman tried to interrupt. "Mrs. Blanco, this is your opportunity to address the court before sentencing." If you have something to say about your crimes or your victims..." Griselda held up her hand and somehow amazingly Judge Spellman stopped talking. "Your Honor, I want you to understand something very clearly. The sentence you're about to impose won't end what I built. It won't undo what I accomplished. And it certainly won't make the men who prosecuted me feel safe." The courtroom had become so quiet that the air conditioning system seemed loud. Because 20 years from now, when you're retired and trying to forget about this case, when these prosecutors are working at law firms and pretending they were heroes, when these federal agents are collecting their pensions, people will still be telling stories about Griselda Blanco. She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping just enough that everyone had to strain to hear her. "They'll remember that a woman from the Barrios became more powerful than the government officials who tried to destroy her. They'll remember that I built something that lasted longer and generated more money than most Fortune 500 companies. They'll remember that it took the entire federal justice system to stop me, and even then they only succeeded because I allowed them to." Judge Spellman's face had gone pale. "Miss Blanco, I need to warn you that anything you say here can be used against me." Griselda smiled for the first time since the trial began. "Your Honor, I'm about to receive multiple life sentences. What exactly do you think you can threaten me with?" She straightened up, and when she spoke again, her voice carried throughout the courtroom with absolute clarity. "But I want to leave you with one final thought. Your Honor, one final truth that I hope you'll remember for the rest of your career." Judge Spellman waited, clearly dreading what was coming next. Griselda looked directly into his eyes and spoke 7 words that would haunt him until the day he died. "You didn't catch me, I let you win." The courtroom erupted. Federal prosecutors jumped to their feet, shouting objections. Defense attorneys tried to get Griselda to sit down. Court security moved toward the podium. Journalists scrambled to write down exactly what they had heard. But Judge Spellman just sat there staring at Griselda Blanco, trying to process what she had just said. Because in those 7 words, she had articulated something that had been bothering him throughout the entire trial. Something about the way evidence had become available, the way witnesses had been discovered, the way her organization had seemed to collapse just when federal investigators were ready to build their case. Had Griselda Blanco really been caught? Or had she orchestrated her own arrest for reasons that no one in that courtroom could understand? Judge Spellman called for order and proceeded with the sentencing. He imposed 3 life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 99 years. Griselda listened to the sentence without any visible reaction, as if she had expected exactly that outcome. As federal marshals prepared to escort her from the courtroom, she turned one last time to look at Judge Spellman. She didn't say anything else, but her expression suggested that she knew something the rest of them didn't, something that would become clear only much later. Over the following months, Judge Spellman found himself thinking about Griselda's final statement more and more frequently. He began reviewing the case files, studying the timeline of the investigation, analyzing how federal agents had obtained their evidence. What he discovered troubled him deeply. Several key pieces of evidence had been obtained through sources that couldn't be fully verified. Witnesses had come forward at precisely the right moments. Phone conversations had been intercepted just when they would be most incriminating. It was almost as if someone had been guiding the investigation, providing investigators with exactly what they needed to build their case, but nothing more. Judge Spellman realized that Griselda might have been telling the truth. She might have allowed herself to be caught, prosecuted, and convicted for reasons that had nothing to do with law enforcement's investigative skills. But why would the most successful drug trafficker in history orchestrate her own downfall? The answer became clear over the following years as federal investigators tried to dismantle what remained of Griselda's organization. Despite her imprisonment, despite the conviction of dozens of her associates, despite the seizure of millions of dollars in assets, her network continued to operate. New leaders emerged who had been trained by Griselda but had never been identified by law enforcement. Financial systems that had been hidden from investigators continued to function. Distribution routes that hadn't been discovered remained active. Within 3 years of Griselda's conviction, her organization was generating more revenue than it had before her arrest. Judge Spellman began to understand what Griselda had accomplished through her conviction. She had sacrificed herself to protect the larger structure she had built. By allowing federal investigators to focus on her personally, she had deflected attention from the systematic innovations that made her organization so successful. Her trial had become a public relations victory for the government, convincing politicians and the media that the war on drugs was being won. Meanwhile, the real source of her power, the networks, the methods, the people she had trained, continued to operate without interference. Griselda Blanco had turned her own prosecution into the ultimate misdirection. She had given federal investigators exactly what they wanted, a high-profile conviction that would make their careers and justify their budgets. In exchange, they had left her real legacy untouched. Years later, when Judge Spellman retired from the federal bench, he was asked by a legal journalist about the most memorable case of his career. Without hesitation, he mentioned the sentencing of Griselda Blanco. "I've sentenced hundreds of criminals," he said. "Most of them begged for mercy or claimed they were innocent. But Griselda Blanco did something I'd never seen before. She made me realize that sometimes the person standing in front of you isn't the one who's really on trial." The journalist asked what he meant. She made me understand that she had judged us before we judged her, and in her mind we had been found wanting. Judge Spellman paused, clearly still troubled by the memory. The most dangerous thing about Griselda Blanco wasn't her willingness to use violence or her ability to move drugs. It was her intelligence. She understood systems better than the people who built them. She understood psychology better than the agents trying to catch her. She understood power better than the prosecutors trying to destroy her. He shook his head. "When she told me you didn't catch me, I let you win." She wasn't boasting. She was teaching. She was showing everyone in that courtroom that real power isn't about avoiding consequences. It's about controlling them. Griselda Blanco served her life sentence at the Federal Correctional Institution in Danbury, Connecticut. Even in prison, she maintained her reputation for intelligence and strategic thinking. She learned to speak fluent English, earned her GED, and became known among other inmates as someone who could solve problems that seemed impossible. Prison officials noted that she never caused disciplinary problems, never got involved in conflicts with other inmates, and never attempted to escape. She seemed to accept her imprisonment as a temporary inconvenience rather than a permanent defeat. In 2004, after serving 19 years, Griselda was deported to Colombia as part of a plea agreement that resolved additional charges that had been filed against her. She returned to Medellin quietly and lived a relatively modest life until her death in But what she had predicted in that Miami courtroom proved to be absolutely correct. 27 years later, people around the world still tell stories about Griselda Blanco. She has been the subject of documentaries, books, movies, and television series. More importantly, the method she pioneered. The organizational structures, the financial systems, the operational innovations continue to influence how sophisticated criminal enterprises operate today. Judge Eugene Spellman died in 2018. According to his family, he never forgot Griselda Blanco's final statement. In private conversations, he would sometimes wonder whether she had been right about letting them win. Whether the most successful prosecution in the history of the war on drugs had actually been the most sophisticated deception ever perpetrated against the American justice system. The 7 words that silenced a courtroom. "You didn't catch me. I let you win." Remain one of the most chilling statements ever made by a defendant at sentencing. Not because they represented defiance or lack of remorse, but because they might have represented the truth. That the woman standing before the court wasn't a captured criminal, but an architect who had just completed her masterpiece. And the courtroom, the trial, the conviction, the sentence, they were all part of her design. Griselda Blanco didn't just challenge the authority of the court that day. She revealed that true power sometimes means sacrificing yourself to protect something more important. Her empire, her legacy, her proof that a woman from the barrios could outsmart the entire federal government, even when they thought they had won. Especially when they thought they had won. Because sometimes, losing is just another way of teaching the world who really has control. And Griselda Blanco never lost control. Not even when she was sentenced to 3 life terms. Not even when she walked out of that courtroom in shackles. Not even when the judge thought he had spoken the final word. Because the final word belonged to her. And she had already spoken it. "You didn't catch me, I let you win." 7 words that turned a sentencing hearing into a masterclass. 7 words that prove the most dangerous criminals aren't the ones who fight the system. They're the ones who use the system to achieve their own goals. And make everyone else think it was their idea. That's the difference between being caught and being tactical. That's the difference between being defeated and being strategic. That's the difference between facing justice and dispensing it. Griselda Blanco understood all 3. And she made sure everyone in that courtroom understood them too, whether they wanted to or not.